you to stand as you're able for the scripture reading in the book of Matthew. When the Son of God comes in his glory and all the angels with him, then he will sit on the throne of his glory. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate people one from another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he will put the sheep at his right hand and the goats at his left. Then the king will say to those at his right hand, "Come, you that are blessed by God, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me." Then the righteous will answer him, "When was it that we saw you hungry and gave you food, or thirsty and gave you something to drink? And when was it that we saw you a stranger and welcomed you, or naked and gave you clothing? And when was it that we saw you sick or in prison and visited you?" And the king will answer them, "Truly I tell you, just as you did it to the least of these who are members of my family, you did it to me." Then he will say to those at his left hand, "You that are accursed, depart from me into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me no food. I was thirsty, and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, and you did not welcome me. Naked, and you did not give me clothing. Sick and in prison, and you did not visit me." And they will also answer, "When was it that we saw you hungry or thirsty, or a stranger, or naked, or sick, or in prison, and did not take care of you?" Then he will answer them, "Truly I tell you, just as you did not do it to the least of these, you did not do it to me. And these will go away into the eternal punishment, but the righteous into eternal life." God's word for God's people.
Thanks be to God.
I feel like I need to name that I'm a little overwhelmed with emotion right now, and I hope that I can get through this. Our youth just spent the previous hour talking with Wiley Dobbs on the phone, and hope that we'll be able to hear a little bit from them about this, about that experience next week. Wiley's picture is here on our table. Wiley is in prison in Georgia and is a member of our congregation, and Joyce has been visiting Wiley for close to 20 years now, or 22 years. And he has been a member of our congregation for several years and has written to our children. Many among us have visited Wiley as well. So I lift Wiley up and our youth for being so great engaging with him, and for his love and compassion for our young people in particular. In an article that I read this week, the author described this text from Matthew as a double exposure photograph. Now, folks are under the age of about 20, I'm guessing, give or take a few years, may have no idea what a double exposure photograph is. But for those of you who do know, you'll recall that when pictures were made using actual physical film that you had to load into a camera and unwind and feed through, sometimes, if you didn't know if the film had already been used once, you might end up using that roll of film a second time in two very different settings. So this meant that later, when you got your film developed, that you would discover that your pictures from the snowstorm in the winter mysteriously included pictures of your trip from the beach in the summer pictures superimposed on top of those winter ones. There you would be putting the scarf around Frosty's neck, right next to yourself several months later, putting the final touches on an elaborate sandcastle at the beach. Or your high school graduation photos might also include beautiful or awkward and intense pictures of your family around the Thanksgiving dinner. Photographers sometimes use this process intentionally for artistic purposes. But whether intentional or by total accident, you would end up seeing things and images from two very distinct moments in time printed in the exact same photo. Sometimes this experience of double exposure elicited a really good laugh at the ridiculousness of the disparate images held in one single frame. And at other times, I remember it eliciting a sense of sadness at the loss of an anticipated single image that held deep significance. Now, in the digital age that we live in now, we don't get surprises like this in the way that we did when we had to take our film over to the CVS and then go back a week later to pick it up to see if any of them actually turned out at all. And digital photography and software like Photoshop have enabled us to do such things more easily with varying degrees of expertise and with a markedly lower likelihood of unexpected outcomes, whether joyful or full of regret. We can simply take a picture, view it, and either erase or save it in real time. This author used this metaphor of double exposure to highlight how Jesus had already embodied what he was asking his followers to do, particularly in the book of Matthew. He offered a clear picture of what it looks like to be awake and to be prepared to use what has already been given to each of us. He had fed hungry people on the hillside. He had welcomed tax collectors, sinners, and other strangers to his meals. We could go verse by verse through this gospel and find one clue after another pointing to Jesus' version of righteousness and kingdom living. His first teaching overlaps his last teaching. Judgment Day intersects with present hour. We live in a double-exposed photograph in which the last day and the present day are a part of the same picture. Judgment is happening all the time, and righteousness is happening all the time, and Jesus is with us all the time. Righteousness is not determined in one single moment with a reward at the end of time, though. It's an invitation that is ongoing, that invites us into life more deeply. Each moment is stamped with both past and present, what we've known and what we have the opportunity to respond and know now, knowing what we know that we didn't know before. This metaphor of a double exposure connected with my own reading of Matthew 25, because I have multiple experiences reading this particular text. The earliest from the faith of my childhood focused on the judgment portion, the text where you do these things in order to be on the right side at the end of your life. And another came when I was in college and visited the Open Door community for the first time, where I encountered people committed to living out these verses not out of fear of eternal punishment, but out of a sense of mission, of being called to discipleship, to engage in the opportunity to serve Christ himself in the here and now. And there are two images that, from that first visit to the Open Door community, that became embedded in my mind and spirit, and sometimes still keep me awake at night. The first was the headlights of our van fanning out over the rain-soaked basketball court at the back of the house, the Open Door community. There were mounds of wet cardboard and blankets sheltering bodies huddled beneath, trying to stay dry and warm. The first time I'd ever taken in such a scene. And the second was a print of Fritz Eichenberg's Christ of the Breadlines. You've maybe seen it. An image that urged me to see Jesus in the faces of folks who filed through the breakfast line that very morning. And I left the Open Door that weekend disturbed and disoriented in the best sense of those two words, though it felt like anything but good news as it was happening. When I look back at those experiences, there were more nuances in both of them than I recognized at the time. For example, in the earlier part of my life, while there was an explicitly named focus on judgment and being okay at the end of your life and being on the right side, I also watched the people around me quietly embodying what Jesus described in these very verses: feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, visiting the sick and the prisoner. I often spent Saturday mornings going around to people's homes who couldn't get out to church with my mom to teach the Sunday school lesson for the next day. There's always cake involved, which is nice. So these people were doing this, but the doing was not the main idea. In fact, it rarely got lifted up, but it was certainly there. It was just what you did. And while it took me longer than I would like to admit to realize it after visiting the Open Door, I came to understand that I didn't have to throw everything I had known or believed prior to that out the window. One didn't have to be completely wrong in order for the other to be right for me in another moment in my life. Both experiences grounded me in a sense of service and connection with my community. Both came from a deep conviction that being a follower of Jesus is intimately tied with how we treat each other. I had come to see this and know this in both places in very different ways, whether I or the people that I was learning it from knew it or not. I began to see this when I released myself, or more accurately, others helped me release myself, from seeing these as two mutually exclusive ways of being in the world. What I came to understand was that what I witnessed and experienced in each of these parts of my life was part of a bigger, more complex picture of my own faith journey, one that continues to unfold and one that continues to challenge me with its nuances and complexities, one that continues to defy being tied down by a simple explanation or set of rules to follow. Each distinct moment just happened to be superimposed upon the moments that preceded it. One of the interesting things that happens in this section of Matthew 25 is that the sheep and the goats, those who are labeled righteous and unrighteous, were equally unaware that their action or inaction toward the hungry, the thirsty, the naked, the sick, and the imprisoned had anything to do with Jesus. None of them knew that they were encountering Jesus when they were doing these things. They actually had more in common than they might have been willing to admit on their own. When Jesus turned to the righteous at his right hand and said, "Come you that are blessed, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the very foundation of the world. Because you have done these things to me," their response was, "Lord, when was it that I saw you hungry and gave you food, or thirsty and gave you something to drink? When was it that we saw you a stranger and welcomed you, or naked and gave you clothing? And when was it that we saw you sick or in prison and visited you?" They had no idea. The unrighteous at his left hand also had zero idea that when they had failed to meet the needs of the hungry, the thirsty, the naked, the sick, and the imprisoned, that they had failed to meet the very needs of Jesus. And they said to him, "When was it that we saw you hungry?" The very same questions. Now, Jesus wasn't shaming either group, I don't think. This is not a story that forces us into right behavior out of fear of the consequences of not following Jesus' teaching. It would be counter to the very core of Jesus' message if we only read this text through that lens of fear. It's insidious. Fear immobilizes us. It limits us by convincing us that we live in the midst of scarcity rather than abundance. Fear keeps us from living fully. Fear limits our capacity to follow Jesus. Time and time again, the gospel story reminds us, fear not. Fear not. Jesus was inviting all of them to live with deeper awareness, inviting all of us to live with deeper awareness and intention. Jesus wanted to expand their understanding of a life of discipleship and faithfulness, to remind them that the opportunities were ever present around them to embody it. I got to be thinking about this image of a double exposure photograph, and I realized that I wanted to add something to it, and I changed my sermon title about 4 times. Thanks to Ken thanks for Ken's flexibility in changing it every time. It really doesn't matter. It really doesn't stop with the double exposure. I think that multiple exposures that we live with and are shaped by as we move through our days and through the different stages of our lives are superimposed upon each other, one upon the other, upon the other. And there's something about this digital age that we live in that feeds that part of ourselves that believes that we can construct perfection on our own. That we can solve the problems around us out of something brand new that no one has ever thought of or imagined yet. Where we Photoshop that just right image, blotting out all else that shows imperfection, weakness, limitation, or simply the humility of admitting what we don't know. Yet I find myself longing more and more for those unexpected moments of wonder and surprise. Those are the places where I have met Christ, where images of members of my growing up youth group show up in the middle of my pictures of BYC with our youth, because the two are connected. Or when Bertha and Rhoda, Sunday school teachers from my childhood, show up in the photograph of the youth with Joyce and me talking with Wiley on the phone with our youth earlier this afternoon. The two are deeply connected. Or when my grandmother shows up in the picture as I'm sitting with someone who is dying, because the two are deeply connected. Or where the picture of my mom starting a new job working with homeless families at the age of 68 and traveling to Lumberton with folks from the Hispanic church in Cullowhee to do flood relief shows up right smack in the middle of the picture of COM folks visiting families at Stewart Detention Center in Georgia. It's all connected. And the truth is, it's all a part of my picture, the same picture. It's complex, it's messy, it's beautiful and tender. And there's not one perfect point that I can point to and say that I finally arrived once and for all at the pinnacle of what it means to meet and respond to Jesus in my daily life. We all have the capacity and opportunity to keep growing and expanding each day of our lives in big and small ways. In the text that we read tonight, people who were meeting the needs of the hungry, the thirsty, the naked, the sick, and the imprisoned didn't even know they were encountering Jesus. And those who failed to meet and respond to those same needs didn't know that they had missed an opportunity. Nevertheless, they still encountered Jesus. There are people, places, and experiences that brought every single one of us right here tonight. When I think about this community and the ways that you help me recognize and become aware, I come up with a really long list, but I'm only going to name a few. I think about the Sermon on the Mount group that's been meeting for over 2 years now. Over 2 years. A group of folks in our circle who meet once a month to talk about the complexity of this central teaching of Jesus and how it shapes their lives, how it keeps working on them and layering the exposures. One that stands out in particular to me is from you, BJ, and how you've talked about how this text has really worked on you in relation to your neighbors who live right next door and who differ from you politically and in other ways, but this text has shaped your interactions with them. I think about the immigration group that's also been meeting monthly for nearly 2 years. Finding ways to connect with our immigrant neighbors, exploring and encouraging sanctuary, responding to community needs, and much more. And I think about Wiley Dobbs, who knows about each one of you. He knows you by name. He knows which of our youth are having a hard time being away from home for the very first time. When I talked to him on the phone on Wednesday, he asked to speak to Abby before we talked about anything else. And at the end of our conversation tonight, he said, "Missy, tell Abby I said hello and that I love her." He was wonderful with conversation with our youth, and they were wonderful in conversation with him. And I wonder, 5, 10, 20 years from now, what the exposures are that are going to be layered on their stories of today. I think about those of us who have helped with retreats for the women at Swannanoa Women's Prison and their children, creating a time and place for them to spend a day or overnight together, a rare thing for those in prison to experience. And I think about the stories that Nancy and Mahan and others have shared from their work in the prison about encountering Christ in the unexpected places. And I think about all of you who gathered last week to sing with Buzz and Susie and the beauty of that. I think about all that has been swirling around in these past 2 days alone as I've been finishing up this sermon, as several of you have been springing to action to respond to and be present when unexpected needs arose in our midst. Thank you. These are just a few of the things that happen when we're together. There's more, so much more, that's seen and unseen. You're doing it every single day, all of you. You're doing it as doctors, as parents, as nurses, as teachers, as friends, as co-workers, as peacemakers, as writers, as builders, as bosses, as musicians, as people of the way. You're meeting Christ, and others are meeting Christ in you. We give and we receive. There are more people and places and experiences that will continue to shape us and take us where we can't even imagine ourselves going from this moment forward. And all the moments of our lives offer us that opportunity to engage and respond and live fully. So let's keep layering those images with our photographs that are already known and that we can see, trusting that Jesus has been with us, that Jesus is with us, and will continue to be with us when we recognize him and when we don't. On your chairs, thought we might put this into action tonight as a group. There's pens around, and those can be shared. There may not be one on each seat. There are 3 cards in your seat, and I'm going to invite you all to take just a moment, and you can do this now. We'll take just a couple of minutes here. You can also finish this during communion, and when you come forward for communion, I invite you to drop those cards into the basket on the front of the table here. And you can do one or both or all 3 of these, however you choose, wherever your spirit is feeling led tonight. I invite you on those cards to write a note to Wiley, and to write a note to Buzz and Susie. We'll mention during prayer time, Buzz was hospitalized yesterday with some heart issues, and so you might write a card for him and a card for Susie. We'll give some more update in just a few moments about that. So we're going to just take a couple of minutes to do those, and after worship, if you want to continue writing, we'll leave this out, give you space to do that.